The story of the boy with the deformed head. Once upon a time there lived a poor man and his wife who had only one child, and this boy, as it happened, was born with a deformed head, which projected in front and behind, and gave him a very ugly appearance. The parents, although much grieved at their son's deformity, were, nevertheless, very fond of him and brought him up very carefully. Every day, when he grew big enough, he used to drive the cows out to pasture, and all day long he sat about on the hillsides watching the cattle graze. And so he passed his life very happily until, when he reached the age of 15, he began to think he should like to marry a wife as other young men did, but he feared that owing to his deformity no girl would ever look at him. One day it chanced that he drove his cows to graze on the rich pasture on the edge of a small lake, and as he was sitting near the shore of the lake all of a sudden he saw a large white drake descend from the sky and light upon the surface of the water. As soon as it was seated upon the water it swam round the lake 3 times to the right and then 3 times to the left, and having done so it flew away again and disappeared into the sky. The boy watched the behavior of this drake with some interest. He had never before seen so large and beautiful a bird, nor one that behaved so strangely. So next day he again sat down in the same place, and kept a sharp lookout for the bird. At the same hour as on the previous day the drake again appeared in the sky, and descending upon the lake, acted in precisely the same manner as before. And it continued to do so for several days, the boy always watching its behavior with increased interest. At last he determined that he would try to catch this drake for himself, so he wove himself a long rope of yak's hair, big enough to completely encircle the lake, and he laid this upon the shore in a loop extending right round the lake. And at short intervals along the rope he fastened loops made of the finest horsehair, the loose ends of which he left floating in the water. Next day the drake came as usual and began to swim round the lake to the right. It had not gone far when it put its foot into one of the loops and was caught. The boy at once ran down to the shore of the lake, and taking the drake in his hands, he tied its wings and legs together, and set it down on the grass beside him. Now, thought he to himself, what shall I do with this fine white drake? I will take him home and kill him, and he will make a nice dinner for father and mother and me. Just as he was thinking this, to his intense surprise, the drake spoke to him as follows. I beg of you not to kill me, my good boy, said he, for you must know I am not in reality a drake as I appear to be, but I am a fairy king just come from the region of the gods. It is my habit every day to descend to this lake in the form of a white drake, and to amuse myself by swimming round and round. If you will now consent to let me go I will reward you liberally. You shall have gold and silver, and jewels and coral, as much as you wish, and sumptuous food every day for the rest of your life. On hearing this the boy laughed, and replied, You should not tell me such stories as these. How am I to know that you are really a fairy? It seems to me that all you are in a position to give me is your feathers. I hope you will not disbelieve my word, replied the drake very earnestly. I assure you I can do all this, and even more, if you will release me. Well, said the boy, if that is really so I will make a bargain with you. I do not care at all for your gold or your jewels, but what I really want is a wife. If you can promise to supply me with a wife I will let you go. Well, said the drake, that, too, can be arranged. I have 3 daughters living in my kingdom in the skies, and I will give you as wife any one of them whom you desire. Would you prefer the eldest, or the youngest, or the middle one? The boy was greatly pleased on hearing this offer of the drake's, and he thought to himself, I will not take the eldest girl, for fear she should be too old, nor the youngest, for fear she should be too young. I will select the middle one. So he told the drake that he would like his middle daughter. Very well, said the drake, I will arrange the matter accordingly, and I will meet you here tomorrow with my middle daughter. But there is one condition which always attaches to the marriage of a mortal with a fairy, and that is that she can only live with you for 9 years. At the conclusion of that time she is bound to return to her home in the heavens. The boy agreed to this condition, and when all the details had been satisfactorily arranged he cut the cords which bound the drake and let him go. The bird spread his wings and flew up into the sky, and after circling for a few minutes he flew straight upwards and disappeared from sight. whilst the boy went home to his father and mother. The drake flew far up into the blue sky until he arrived at the country of the gods, where he changed at once into the form and raiment of the king of the fairies. Seating himself upon his throne, he summoned his 3 daughters before him and informed them of what had occurred, and he gave orders to his middle daughter to prepare herself forthwith to go and marry a mortal. The girl wept bitterly on hearing this, but nevertheless she prepared to carry out her father's orders, and got ready a large stock of beautiful clothes and much gold and silver and jewels to take with her. Next day, at the appointed hour, the boy went down to the lake as usual, and seated himself in his usual place, and not long afterwards he saw the white drake and a white duck flying towards him from the sky. They descended swiftly until they touched the ground, where they were at once transformed into the fairy king and his beautiful daughter. The boy was overcome with joy when he saw the lovely wife that had been brought to him, but the girl was horrified at his ugly appearance, and begged her father to take her back to her abode in the skies. The fairy king, however, insisted upon her carrying out her share of the bargain, so leaving his daughter with the boy, he again turned himself into a drake and, flying up into the sky, he disappeared from view. The boy now led his bride home to his father and mother, and next day the marriage was duly completed. The fairy wife, by means of her magic, was able to erect a magnificent palace, and to furnish it in the most luxurious manner with everything necessary for comfort, and she supplied, moreover, horses and servants, and everything else that a married couple could desire. So the two took up their abode in this fine house and, together with the old father and mother, they lived there happily for several years, and as time passed away the fairy wife became accustomed to her husband's forbidding appearance, and year by year became more and more attached to him. So the time slipped by and at last the 9 years of the fairy wife's abode upon earth came to an end. The young man, however, had become so accustomed to her presence that he could hardly believe that the fairy king's words would come true, and that he should really be deprived of his wife when the appointed time arrived. So on the last night of the 9th year he went to bed as usual in his magnificent chamber, clothed in rich silks, and surrounded by all the evidences of wealth and luxury. He slept soundly all night, and when he awoke in the morning and sat up and looked about him, what was his astonishment and horror to discover that, instead of lying upon his fine couch in his magnificent palace, with troops of servants ready to wait upon him, he was reposing upon the bare ground under the open sky, on a bleak hillside near to the spot where he had first conversed with the fairy king. His palace, his servants, his horses, his furniture, and, worst of all, his beautiful wife, had all disappeared utterly and completely, and nothing remained of them but a memory. Half distracted with grief and chagrin, the young man ran frantically across the country, thinking to find some trace of his lost happiness. For some days he wandered on, scarcely conscious of what he was doing, and at length, having passed beyond the part of the country which he knew, he arrived one day about noon on the shores of a vast expanse of water which stretched before him as far as he could see. By the side of this lake there arose a jagged cliff, and about halfway up the cliff on a broad ledge he noticed an immense nest, in which appeared some young birds of unusual size. At first he was unable to detect what sort of birds these were, but after examining them attentively for some time he saw that they were 3 young griffins, whose parents apparently had gone off in search of food. As he stood upon the beach watching the young birds, they suddenly began to manifest every sign of terror and confusion, chattering and squealing wildly to one another, and flapping their puny wings, and on turning towards the lake in order to ascertain what was the cause of their alarm, he perceived an immense dragon, whose head, at the end of its long neck, towered high above the water, making its way rapidly across the lake, with the evident intention of devouring the young griffins. The young man, who was of a courageous and kindly disposition, determined to save the young griffins from the maw of this monster, so, drawing his sword, he waited till the dragon had set foot upon dry land, and then, attacking him fiercely, he engaged single-handed in a desperate conflict. For some time the issue was doubtful, but the young man at length succeeded with one well-delivered blow in severing the dragon's head from its neck, and the monster fell dead upon the beach. Scarcely had the dragon breathed its last when the air was darkened by the wings of some great creature passing overhead, and, looking up, he observed, flying just above him, the forms of the two parent griffins now returning to their nest. As soon as they had arrived, the young griffins proceeded to relate to them at full length the terrible danger they had just escaped, and the gallant conduct of the young man in slaying their would-be destroyer. The parent griffins were very pleased when they heard this story, and, looking towards the young man with some curiosity, they began to remark upon his appearance. "Have you ever, Mother Griffin," asked the male bird, "seen any creature of that description before?" "No, Father Griffin, I never have," she replied, "but it seems to be both brave and well-intentioned. I observe, moreover, that it has neither beak nor claws, so I propose that we invite it into the nest, and receive it hospitably in return for a good service which it has rendered to our children." Father Griffin agreed to this proposal, and he at once flew down to the beach, and addressing the young man he invited him to enter the nest. The youth accepted the invitation, and having explained that he was unable to fly, he mounted upon the griffin's back and was speedily carried up the cliff and deposited with the young griffins in the nest. After making a good dinner off the food which the parent griffins had just provided for their young ones, the young man related to the family all his various adventures since the time when he had first made the acquaintance of the Fairy King. "Yours," said Father Griffin, "is a very sad story, and in my opinion you have not been treated at all well, but if you desire it, I may perhaps be of some assistance to you. What I propose is that you should mount upon my back, and I will then carry you through the air to the kingdom of the gods, where you can represent your case to the king of the fairies in person, and where you will, at any rate, have the opportunity of persuading your wife to accompany you back to earth." The young man gladly assented to this proposition, and mounted on the griffin's back, and the great bird, spreading his wings, soared upward straight into the blue sky, carrying the youth with him. Up and up they flew, whilst the earth seemed to recede into the distance and to grow smaller and smaller, until at length it disappeared from view altogether. Still they flew on until, towards nightfall, they arrived at the country of the gods. The griffin, with the young man upon his back, flew straight in through the great golden gates, and deposited the youth in the center of a vast courtyard round which were sitting numbers of gods, fairies, and other denizens of the sky. When the gods saw that a human being had been deposited in their midst, they rose in great wrath, and began bitterly to reproach the griffin for what he had done. "How is it," said they, "that you have dared, unordered, to bring into our presence an inhabitant of the human world? Do you not know that human beings are of a coarser essence than ourselves, and are repugnant and abhorrent to us? How dare you so defile the sacred country of the gods?" But the griffin was not at all frightened at their anger, and he answered them boldly and firmly. "This young man," said he, "is a valiant and kind-hearted youth. He saved my young ones from destruction by attacking, single-handed, and killing a dragon who was on the point of devouring them. He then related to me his story of how, after 9 years of happiness, he was deprived by the king of the fairies of his wife, his house, his wealth, and everything which he had possessed. I consider, therefore, that he has been treated in a shameful and unjustifiable manner, and so I have brought him here to plead his cause in person and to claim redress." While this conversation was in progress, the young man's fairy wife had been hiding in a corner, too nervous to show herself before her husband and all the assembly of the gods. But she could now contain herself no longer, and, rushing forward, she threw herself into her husband's arms, crying out that she loved him and would return with him to earth. When her father heard this, he did not know how to act, but it was decided that a conclave should be held, and the matter debated at length. So the celestial powers met together in a great council, and, having discussed the matter in all its bearings, they decided that, as the fairy princess desired to return to earth of her own free will, they would not stand in her way, but that if she did so, she must take the consequence of her own action, and that as the result of mating with an unclean creature like a human being, she must herself become mortal and lose her fairy nature. On hearing this decision, the girl joyfully agreed. So she and her husband mounted together upon the broad back of the griffin, and the great beast, spreading his wings, sailed through the golden gates of the palace and swept downwards through the blue heavens to the earth below. He soon deposited the youth and his wife on the ground near their old home, where he bade them farewell and returned to his own nest. And henceforward, although the fairy had lost her magic powers, the two lived happily together, and grew to a good old age in prosperous and comfortable circumstances.